Well, welcome, Nat Dyer. I'm so happy to be discussing your wonderful new book titled Ricardos Dream: How Economics Forgot the Real World and Led Us Astray. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, David. Delighted to be here.
Um, I've read the book and reviewed it in a print review that accompanies this podcast, and it just resonates with everything else I've read and I'm currently working on with paradigmatic thinking and economics. So please introduce yourself as a person and how you came by this interest, your background, and how you came by this interest in economics in general, and delving into its history.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah, so I'm a writer and researcher based in the UK. And for a number of years now, I've been working on the field of global political economy. So that might be new to some people, but a group of scholars in the 1970s decided that neither economics nor politics was really able to understand the changes that were happening at the global level. So they tried to bring them together in a new synthesis. And I've done some work on reviving the writing of Susan Strange, who was one of the prime movers of that area. And my background is in working for various NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So I've worked doing research and writing and campaigning on a bunch of different subjects, such as economic pluralism, so sort of breaking the monopoly of just sort of one way of understanding the economy, corruption, mainly in mining and oil, and also on deforestation. And yeah, Ricardo's Dream is my first book, published by Bristol University Press. I could say a little bit more about how I came across that story, or what particularly intrigued me about it, if you'd like.
yeah, please, please.
So yeah, so the story is, I guess, well, it was actually, I was reading an article by Matthew Watson, who is a political economist based at Warwick Uni here in the UK. And he had written about Ricardo's, there's a classic example, I might be skipping ahead a little bit, of David Ricardo, and he had written about the huge difference between the theory, which is taught to, has been taught to generations and generations of students, and the actual history. And it kind of, I knew some of it, but the details that he brought to it kind of blew my mind. And I thought, wow, if I can actually write this if I can make a book out of this, and use this as an example of the gap between theory and the reality, that might be something that resonated with a lot of people. So it was combining that insight with another insight, in that the whole way of doing economics, when you get so into the theory that you become effectively blind to what's happening, has been called the Ricardian vice, after the same David Ricardo. And so I wanted to, yeah, combine those two insights. And I guess it was through enjoying reading, non-fiction books for the general readership myself, that I wanted to have a go at doing it. Although with most of these things, I massively underestimated how tricky it was going to be. So it took me about, 3 or 4 years from, beginning of the project to the end. But it was well worth it, I think.
Yeah, so and it is indeed just a fascinating history, just as a story. It's fascinating, and we'll get to what you just covered soon enough. Well, let's introduce our main character, David Ricardo, um, who was his dates were 1772 to 1823. So let's introduce our main character, his dream and his vice, which are the same. So,
Mm.
so who was David Ricardo, and what was his dream?
Yeah, so he was one of the richest men in England, of his time, which was his adult life, as you say, the early 1800s. And that was around the time when Britain was fighting against the French, led by Napoleon. And Ricardo was one of the main players in the London Stock Exchange, and actually was helping to fund the government, who was needing to raise huge amounts of money to pay for their armies. And he had decades and decades in the stock exchange where he made huge amounts of money. And through that, and also through reading Adam Smith, as I explain, um, earlier in his life, he became interested in economics. And when he left the stock exchange, he retired to a grand country house, which is now sort of home to royalty. Now, Princess Anne, the late Queen Elizabeth's daughter, lives there. And there he wrote his great book, which is The Principles of Political Economy in 1817. And that was really the major attempt at synthesizing economic knowledge, the first major attempt since Adam Smith about 40 years earlier. And it had a massive impact. And there are many different aspects to his work, but the one that stuck with us most is his writing on international trade. And so he's called the father of international economics. And he's known as one of the founding figures of economics. And I argue in the book that he should, and he has been seen by many people as equal to Adam Smith as one of the sort of co-founders of political economy. But where Adam Smith was often very historical and very detailed and would delve into, the minutiae of different treaties and exactly how much things were worth in different areas. You don't find that in Ricardo at all. What you find is these highly conceptual investigations into different areas. And I argue that when he stuck to areas that he knew well, such as the Bank of England or the stock exchange, he was actually, quite good. But then he went further and further into other areas such as foreign trade, agricultural, general theories of society. And his tether to reality, he got more and more speculative. But he was so sort of enamored by the conceptual clarity of his world that that he began to sort of get lost in this theoretical dream world. And so to some people that has been his great virtue. And some people have said, oh, Ricardo helped bring economics up to the status of a science because he created one theoretical framework that could bring all these things together. But for others, as I've said, that's his vice. And so his dream was trying to capture all of these things in one theoretical framework, and his vice was believing in it too much, even when the evidence kept pointing the other direction.
Well, there's a wonderful quote that I got, actually not from your book, but from the Wikipedia entry on Ricardo, in which he says, this was a quote from one of his peers and friends, John Lewis Millay, who wrote, "He meets you upon every subject that he has studied with a mind made up and opinions in the nature of mathematical truths. It is this very quality of the man's mind, his entire disregard of experience and practice, which makes me doubtful of his opinions on political economy."
I love it. Yeah, and you picked that up in your review, which you kindly sent me ahead of publication. Yeah, it's a great quote. It's one of those things that there's always too much to fit in a book. But I think that sums it up well. And the reason why this is important now, 200 years later, is that we are living in a time when the globalization, or some people call hyperglobalization era, that was really created in the 1990s and 2000s, is sort of crumbling and falling apart. And David Ricardo was one of those names used by Nobel Prize winners and top economists and politicians time and time again to say, if you don't like what we're doing with globalization, you're going against 200 years of history. These are, the best, this is utterly true, immensely sophisticated
You're just so stupid.
work.
You don't even understand Econ 101. You're so dumb.
Exactly. And so part of what I'm trying to say is, hold on a minute. Let's, there's a lot of weight being put on this David Ricardo guy. Let's have a look at what he said, and also what other people such as Millay said about him.
Well, part of the background for all of this, and I just get this from every book I read on the period, is that first of all, there was a pressing need to make economics, or in general, the study of humanity, scientific. That was just like the whole Enlightenment project. Religion was on the wane. And what was science but Newton? And so it was first to be scientific, and secondly, what that meant was to be emulating Newton with timeless laws. was the project, and it was the project, and you could sympathize with it to a degree because in its absence, you just had this big war of opinions. You had no authority basically, and so that's what science meant at the time. It includes Ricardo. It also includes like the first general equilibrium theorists, people like Leon Walras in France and so on. And actually, if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between them, because one thing you said in our email correspondence that even though Ricardo had this mathematical mind, it was only proto-mathematical. He wasn't actually mathematically sophisticated, but he was still thinking in very sort of crisp mechanical terms. And maybe you could say a little bit more about how he was in the first place very theoretical and dealing in terms of timeless laws, but in the second place, not a mathematical sophisticate, as I understand it.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's a lot in that, and I really like, and it's one of the themes of my book, and as you pointed out, around the sort of the analogy from Newton of, oh, we have these physical laws for predicting what would happen with bodies in space. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could do the same thing for society? And as you say, countless sort of figures have tried to do that. And Ricardo was one of the more successful, at least in convincing other people that he had done it. And again, you can see that through to our current day when you have, economists advising, how should Russia transition to capitalism in the 1990s? And there's a big idea of, oh, it's one set. Capitalism and economics works the same anywhere. Gravity doesn't care whether you believe in it or not, nor does economics. So therefore, the way is just to sort of open things up, and prices will work. And that is something that dramatically backfired in Russia. And I also show some of the other ways in which it's backfired in history. But yes, no, it's interesting. So Walras, Jevons, and some of these other figures who are sometimes known as the marginalist school, they are often portrayed as being very different to Ricardo. And they did break from some of Ricardo's core theories, not to get too technical, but about his theory of value. Ricardo subscribed to a labor theory of value, and they had a more subjective theory of value, and they were much more mathematically sophisticated. But that has led some people to think that political economy, as it used to be called when Smith and Ricardo was doing it, was much more historical and multidisciplinary. And I argue that some thinkers were, such as Adam Smith, but others, such as Ricardo, were still far too narrow and proto-mathematical. I think the way I describe it is that a lot of Ricardo's mathematics came from his day job, essentially, as a stockbroker. This is a job he started when he was 14. His father, his uncles, his brothers were all in the stock market. And there are contemporary accounts about his tremendous cool judgment and his ability to stream through these calculations. And if you read them, they sound very, very similar to what we ascribe to Homo economicus, or economic man, which is this sort of crude reduction at the center of so many models.
You
And
have
I
a quote in
argue,
there. You have a quote in there from Ricardo to the extent of he's saying that everything is driven by self-interest. We can't let in any other motives. And it's like that's like Gordon Gekko speaking.
totally.
But it's just that he wasn't a selfish man. I mean, I think if you look at him as a person, he was quite a, I don't know, pro-social gentleman, whatever. Um, you wouldn't call him like a greed is good fundamentalist um, um, in his personality, but nevertheless, that was his credo. And all of this born in the stock market. That kind of shocked me that the birth of economics was so continuous with the birth of this thing called a stock market, which was, historically just very young. Is that right? So
Yes, yeah, very young. I mean, as I understand it, the first sort of stock market was in Amsterdam, and Ricardo's ancestors were from there. And then it came to the UK, and Ricardo was actually on the founding committee of the, they started off in coffee houses and then eventually they moved to more exclusive building that was the stock exchange in 1802, and Ricardo was on the founding board for that body and was one of the major figures. And so yeah, I argue that a lot of his economics was him looking out to the world and seeing a mini stockbroker inside every human,
Yeah.
sort of, weighing everything up. And I think given that, and you've written extensively about this, how, hugely influential this idea of, economic human, or, the individual selfish maximizer is, I think it sort of helps to show how extreme and unrealistic that is if you see it as this huge leap of imagination, rather than as this sort of, scientific principle.
Yeah. So it's so fascinating. And I think you estimate that his wealth was 4 times the wealth of Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. Isn't that how you expressed his wealth? And he really did play a decisive role in the Battle of Waterloo by financing it. Uh,
He
uh,
was there are many myths around the Waterloo battle, but no, he did take on half of the largest loan of the government just 4 days before the Battle of Waterloo, and made a huge amount of money out of it.
and also just to put the story around it, that he broke with his Jewish family and married a Quaker girl,
Mm,
converted to Unitarianism, and they
mm.
just that was the end of his family relations. They disowned him. His mother never spoke to him again, and so then he continued to be hugely successful in the very same business. Just I also learned, just to share, anecdotes, that the great Isaac Newton that everyone was emulating scientifically was also in charge of the mint and was himself dabbled in the stock market, not so successfully. And I think you quote Isaac Newton in saying that he could predict the orbit of the planets, but he could not predict the stock market, somewhat ruefully. And
Yes, yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's a great microcosm right there.
Yeah, he was
That
caught.
says volumes.
He was caught on the wrong side of the South Sea bubble of 1720, and yeah, had, I think, something about a third of his wealth in there, and it all blew up in his face. And he still died a very wealthy man, but yes, he did say something like that.
Well, let's cover this one. What made him famous for international trade? This little tinker toy example that he invented, which is fascinating. I mean, it's a very cool example about um, specialization in trade, which is still taught to this day. And then contrast that with the much more complicated picture that you detail in your book, because that's kind of representative of the comparison between the theory, the pretty little theory, um, and the real and the much more complex real world.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks. Yeah. So Ricardo's theory, which is called the theory of comparative advantage, is it basically, the import of the theory is that it doesn't matter if you are worse at producing every single commodity than another country. Both countries can still trade as long as they focus on what they're least worst at, and they can both benefit, and the world as a whole can benefit. And he argued this with a number of different examples, but the one that's really stuck is England and Portugal exchanging cloth and wine. And he gives you a number of different numbers for how efficient both England and Portugal are at producing these two commodities. You have two
Four
countries.
numbers in particular, only four numbers that this example is based on.
Exactly. So they're called sometimes by Paul Samuelson, who's a 20th century American economist, influential figure. They're called Ricardo's four magic numbers. And yes, and you crunch the numbers and you realize that in the model, this is in model land rather than in real world. In the model, even though England is worst at producing both commodities, both England individually, Portugal individually, and the globe as a whole can benefit if England specializes in cloth, which is least worst at, and Portugal supplies wine. And that is something that's been taught to countless generations, and it's loved for being somewhat counterintuitive, has a little bit of mathematics in there, And almost, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say in the 90s and 2000s, and to some extent even now, you couldn't call yourself an economist unless you sort of subscribed to that viewpoint.
Now this
And so,
assumes like instant substitutability, right? That a nation could actually shift from producing both wine and cloth to producing entirely wine, and whatever the per unit costs and benefits were would remain the same. That's part of the example. Is that right?
yes, yeah. I mean, there are tons of assumptions built in, which is kind of Ricardo's speciality. Yeah, instant substitution of products. Also, that the people who are not who are put out of work in one line can immediately go into another line
A
of
cloth
business.
maker can immediately become a winemaker, and
Exactly. There's no shipping costs. And not I'm not arguing that economics has not, worked on some of these, this was a basis which has been built on and extrapolated, and some of these other areas have been brought in. But as a kind of core theory taught to students and also sort of reproduced in, high-end newspapers and magazines, it has continued up to our time as this kind of canonical theory, as you say, almost to the point of saying, Paul Krugman in the 90s actually compared people who didn't believe in it to evolution deniers. It was, it was science, and if you didn't believe in it, it wasn't science. And what the article I mentioned at the top of the podcast and that introduced me to it, Matthew Watson, points out is that there was, a real trade in English cloth and Portuguese wine, and it was beneficial to both sides, to those commodities in both sides, but it was in a completely different context. In that Portugal never exported enough wine to make up for the cloth that it imported from Britain. And cloth at the time was the high-end industrial good. And what it did, Portugal, obviously Britain and Portugal at the time were both colonial powers, and Portugal controlled Brazil, and there'd just been a massive gold rush in Brazil, which lasted most of the 18th century. And so Portugal, 2/3 of that gold only came to Portugal briefly before being re-exported to England to make up for its persistent trade surplus. And as you said, Isaac Newton, who was in control of the mint, the famous, scientist and physicist, actually grew rich coining some of that Brazilian gold into British guineas. And that's not the end of the story, because that that Brazilian gold was actually mined by enslaved Africans, and it was one of the gold rush. There are many things that drove the transatlantic slave trade, not least sugar production in the Caribbean islands, but the Brazilian gold rush in the 18th century was a prime mover of it. And so, yeah, on one level, you've got this neat theoretical win-win. On another level, you've got a more historically accurate story of exploitation and slavery. And I think that, essentially the theory is a very sanitized, romanticized version, and it almost leaves exploitation and colonialism out by, at the ground level. It can never come in the conclusions, because it was never admitted at the beginning of the theory.
yeah, yeah. So so let's see, where do you want to go from here? Let's you choose the next step of our conversation.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean there's many, yeah, we could continue down the road of what happened to international trade theory, or we could go down the road of the sort of death and then rebirth of Ricardo's way of doing economics,
Well, I
if
think
you like.
what I want to concentrate on is that, first of all, Ricardo was not the only one who had a dream, this highly theoretical dream, that there could be laws of economics and human society as sure, as universal as gravity. And so this had tremendous appeal, but it also had critics all the way back. And so I begin my review by saying, read almost any recent critique of neoclassical economic theory, and you will find its reality pointed out. Homo economicus is nothing like flesh and blood humans, we are told again and again and again. That's the modern literature. And what your book shows, of course, is that that extends over 200 years, both advanced and critiqued. And I love the quotes, some of the quotes that you have, which I lifted out for my review, about famous economists who critique the unreality. So this has been some, you call it a cultural polymorphism, or um, as that has been static for 200 years. So we've got Ricardo's Dream. Let's focus on some of the critiques. People like Schumpeter, who called it Ricardo's vice. Um, uh, Keynes, who I'll quote in a minute, because he, I think, provides a diagnosis as to why this remains entrenched despite its unreality, and others. In fact, let me quote the quote from Keynes, because his diagnosis, he says that it was adapted to carry a vast and consistent logical superstructure gave Ricardo's theory beauty. And so the beauty of this, I think, is an important part. That it could explain much social injustice and apparent cruelty as an inevitable incident in the scheme of progress, and that the attempt to change such things is likely on the whole to do more harm than good, commended it to authority. So now we have basically that this was more or less justifying the status quo, that it afforded a measure of justification to the free activity of the individual capitalist, attracted it to the support of the dominant social force behind authority. So once again, this was something that not only did it have beauty and the authority of science behind it, or at least it seemed to, which it, in retrospect is not at all. Um, but also that it was basically justifying the status quo, that this was something which the elites could have their own interest in in endorsing. So please now take your turn. And why is it that the critical side of this, which for a period of history had its way, and Ricardo's Dream was for a period just on the decline, and then revived itself in the current period, which you call the return of unreality. So let's cover the decline period.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. As you say, there's quite a lot in it. And I guess one of the things I was trying to show, again, this is a deeply historical book, but I'm trying to speak to what's happening now. And as you know, as you say at the beginning of the review, there are tons and tons of critiques of neoclassical economics. And many of them do focus on the unreality of the theory. But what I wanted, but those are often rejected by mainstream economists, essentially saying you don't know what you're talking about, or you're critiquing this because you don't understand the theory. And so what I wanted to show by showing that 200-year tradition of saying similar things throughout 200 years is that, one, people advancing that critique now, it's not something recent, and two, that they are and two, that there were many great figures within economics itself who were saying similar things. Yeah, and so I cover mainly the historical school, and figures in so there's someone called William Whewell, who was actually the person who coined the term scientist, and I'm sure you know about him through his influence on Darwin. And he was a great disbeliever in Ricardo's economics, and he worked with a historical economist called Richard Jones, and they went down and tried to track the documents down to prove some of Ricardo's theories wrong, and they were actually quite influential. And then there were later historical and institutional economists, many in the US, such as Veblen, who you mention in your review. And it sort of went in with a much broader strain that has been called the revolt against formalism. And it was this idea that you cannot capture the sort of chaotic flow of events with these highly abstract theories, and that you needed something much more subtle in order to understand what was happening with society. And so that didn't completely dominate, but the sort of orthodox, economic man idea of economics was only one competing school of thought for many, many decades. And as you say, that was re-emphasized again by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, and then by other thinkers such as Schumpeter in the 50s. But by then, as I explained, we've already started that tack back to, as I describe it, the return of unreality, which has led to the current orthodoxy today. I don't
So
know if that covers what you
why the
wanted.
return? And is Milton Friedman a a good exemplar of the kind of an icon of the? Is he the like the motto? Was he the modern Ricardo?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the modern Ricardo. I mean, I see Milton Friedman as one of the most impressive polemicists, impressive public arguers in the 20th century. And I do talk about him, but also Paul Samuelson, as being, in their own ways, pushing forward the return of unreality and this. And Milton Friedman particularly, his particular contribution, among many others, was a 1953 essay on methodology in economics, which I'm sure you know, in which he sort of took aim at this, long-standing critique of unrealistic assumptions, and essentially said, the more unrealistic assumptions, the better the theory, which was kind of a wild thing for him to say. But despite the fact that it was critiqued very strongly, and other people who went on to win the Nobel Prize, such as Herbert Simon and Paul Samuelson, Herbert Simon described this as building economics on the principle of unreality. And yet those arguments were kind of ignored because they allowed economic theorists to essentially play with the models as they wish and come up with a whole load of new theories that were highly influential in a range of different areas, from finance to trade to response to climate change, as we might get to. So yeah, Milton Friedman definitely played a role among others.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so uh, we could fast forward to the present, and my own work on this with Dennis Snower and my
Mm,
collaboration with Eleanor Ostrom and others. And what
mm,
we say in the present is that we make two critiques and then offer one solution. Our critique number one is the critique of neoclassicals, just like everybody else. But we do acknowledge that it is an integrative framework. I mean, it's got that at least. Um, it deserves the word paradigm. It's an interlocking set of ideas. You bet it is. So that's one thing. Too bad that it's so unreal. Um, uh, the alternative to it we call diffuse pluralism, basically many perspectives that are in fact not integrated with each other, 1,000 separate critiques which do not cohere with each other. And so what's needed, we say, is another paradigm, something else that counts as an integrative framework. And for us, that something is a combination of complex system science and evolutionary science, both new within the last 50 years, complex system science because it required the advent of widespread computing, and evolutionary science because evolution was focused on genetic evolution for most of the 20th century and didn't really become generalized or include human cultural evolution until the last 50, 50 years. And so the idea that evolution slash complexity, but let's say evolution, provides an alternative to both this other paradigm and diffuse pluralism and no theory, basically, or no consistent theory. That's what's really new. But that has historical roots also, as we've been discussing. So I'm kind of making public conversation we've been having on email. I mean, when uh, people responding to Darwin himself and Darwin's theory himself were not slow to make that very same point. And this happened in America. That's what Veblen stands for. is what people call and you call the German historical school stands for, which basically, although not specifically evolutionary, perhaps not influenced by Darwin per se, certainly not our modern conception of Darwin, not at all, but still was placing an emphasis on history. And, the current arrangement is different, was different in the past, can be different in the future. No way that there's general timeless laws. It was paradigmatically different that way. And so what I'm eager to discuss with you is to what extent that was actually taking place more in Germany and the United States and not so much in England, or maybe it was and you just didn't have time to cover it in your book so much. But just flush that out for me um, a little bit as to what extent were people actually turning to Darwin's theory as an alternative that rivaled Newton in
Mm.
in scientific authority.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and I would, yeah, it's great to have the opportunity to discuss it with you, because we might have a somewhat different emphasis, because I have a very strong and consistent emphasis on historical and institutionally formed economists critiquing both classical economics and also sort of the modern neoclassical economics. And Darwin only pops up every now and again in my narrative with Veblen. Although, as you know, it's something I'm very interested in, and interested in the different, I'm interested in how the stories around, I call them stories, but around evolution have influenced society. And I think you can see that they have influenced it for good and ill, depending on what kind of stories have been drawn from evolution. Because, as you know, there are a whole load of rival theories of evolution as well at various times in history in the last
Well,
200
we
years.
haven't even mentioned the history of social Darwinism, and many
Mm,
people, they reflexively think that, when Darwinism was applied to public policy, it was social Darwinism, and that was horrible.
mm,
Actually, the real history is much, much, much more complex
totally.
than that. And our great colleague Jeff Hodgson has discussed that in
Mm,
detail. We could go in that direction, but
yeah.
but
No, and you have
continue on your end.
you have very interesting figures such as John Dewey,
Yeah.
American philosopher, but also, social theorist and economic theorist, although he's not really known for that anymore, who was influenced by Darwin in much more, as you would term it, pro-social ways. Um, but yeah, I did largely keep the book, pretty much the first part of the book, which focuses on Ricardo, is focused on England, and then the later part of the book, which looks at the rebirth of economics, is more focused on America, because essentially that's where most of the orthodox mainstream theorizing was happening, then in the UK and later in the US. And yeah, and that's what I focus on. And I only but the historical school is known as being people talk about the German historical school, but often they miss that these were very strong interactions with Germany and the UK and the US. I think more directly with the US, because I understand it, a lot of the sort of in the 1870s, 1880s, all like a whole cadre of American academics were trained in Germany and directly learnt from German scholars, and then went over to the US. But I do think, I do think there was a large number of British historical economists who were quite crucial in sort of helping to shatter, basically leading to the death of Ricardo's classical economics. And yeah, I don't know if I fully answered the question. I could.
Well, say a little bit about one of Keynes' points, which I left aside, the idea of basically who benefits from these ideas. Um, and uh, and what do you have to say about the fact that the highly theoretical view does justify the status quo, does justify, for example, the distribution of wealth that results in a laissez-faire economy is basically everybody getting their just desserts, no matter how unequal the distribution. If that's what you're getting, that's what you're actually providing to the economy. And on the other hand, the more evolutionary school or historical school saying basically, out with the old and with the new, and being much more right, and much more able to critique current practices as Veblen did, is predatory. What we're seeing is predatory behavior.
Mm.
And then that being a factor in how well these ideas are endorsed and perpetuated based or basically on who benefits.
I definitely think that I definitely think that is a major part of it. And I mentioned the global political economist Susan Strange, and her sort of mantra. She would always ask our students who benefits. That was
Yeah, say more about her, by the way, because you've mentioned her twice, and I think it's important to actually introduce her more fully in what her role is in this.
Yeah, so she was born in the 1920s and died at the end of the 1990s, and helped to create this new field of global political economy. And she is a thread that runs through the book. And at many times, I'm able to find in her writings where she was highly prescient in her diagnosis, both of seeing what was wrong with Ricardos' theory, but also in other areas such as financial markets. She critiqued the deregulation of global finance in the 80s as casino capitalism, and I think with the various financial crises, she has been proved correct. And yeah, as I said, I really like, there's a phrase of yours where you talk about the academia is not an ivory tower, but an ivory archipelago. It's kind of, spread out. And she was very much in in that viewpoint, arguing against this sort of spreading out of specialisms. She was trying to bring things together and see how things work from a structural point of view. I think that's probably as far as I'll go. But I did want to come back to your point about justifying the status quo. Yeah, and I tried to argue that I tried to look at both the naive misuse of models and the knowing misuse of models. And what I call the naive misuse of models is, you've spoken in the past about how, actually in many different fields, the attempt to create these very simplistic models in the 50s, 60s, and 70s actually led to this very narrow methodological individualism. And it wasn't actually ideological. It was just the constraints of the technology
The
and the
constraints of
ideas of
math.
the
The
time.
constraints of math.
Exactly. So I definitely think that is what's happening. But I also think, parallel to that, both in Ricardo's time and in the more recent economics, you see the specific interest of a small group of society being rebranded as the general interest, and these kind of theories have allowed that rebranding to happen. And rather surprising to me, you Adam Smith warns that this is a danger. And so, although I'm critiquing sort of some elements of economic history, I'm saying there are others, such as Adam Smith, who warned against this. I can go into more specific details if you want about financial markets or trade or response to climate change or anti-monopoly, or I don't know if you want to keep it on the general level or
I
talk
think let's
about
keep it on the general level
Mm.
and wrap up in 5 or 10
Mm.
minutes, encouraging people to read your book. And we could have a part 2 anytime you want. There's a famous painting of Newton by William Blake, is that right?
Yes.
And it shows him. I don't know if you have it handy
Mm.
to actually show it. Do
It's
you?
I've got it in the book there. I don't know if I don't know if you
So
can see
yeah,
that.
hold it up close and I'll describe it. So what we see is he's sitting on this kind of big stone ledge, which is like encrusted with lichens, or I guess he's supposed to be at the bottom of the sea or something. And he's bent over, and his entire mind is concentrating on this what would it be, the instrument that he's holding on a piece of paper, basically, is his theorizing on a piece of paper. Could you provide historical context for that? Because it's really emblematic. And I've read it also in others that, especially a biography of John Stuart Mill that I read about how basically there was a war between the Enlightenment figures and the Romanticists. And I think that the picture by Blake is a Romanticist critique of science, as I understand it, which makes it like super fascinating. I just wonder, you know much more about it than I do, if you could flesh that out.
No, it's one of those images, as you say, that in some ways tries to summarize, in some ways helps to summarize one of my main points. So I'm really pleased you brought it up. Yeah, so William Blake, who was quite a revolutionary, his friends with Tom Paine and others, who was quite a revolutionary poet and printmaker, working actually at the same time as David Ricardo in the late 17 and early 1800s. And he drew this image, as you say, of Newton minutely focused on this small mathematical symbol, whilst blind to the larger forces behind him. And it's quite an emblematic photo. If you've ever been
Was
to
that his
the
intention? I just wanted to make sure that was his intention. That was the
no,
point of it.
yes, no, I
Okay,
believe
good.
so. And he wrote to a friend once and said, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." I contrast that with, that there has been poetry that has, eulogized Newton. So there was a line from Alexander Pope: "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." So, so that's the idea that Newton illuminated everything. And then in Blake, you get the idea that essentially Newton has blinded you to most things. And I think, I'm the book. I try not to go for one or the other, but I try to show that push and pull. And I think, yeah, I think that the so-called romantics are often dismissed as, sentimentalist, only guided by feeling and emotion. But actually, there was a lot of intellectual curiosity there. And I mentioned a book. It's called The Age of Wonder by Richard Holmes, and it talks about major figures in science, such as Humphrey Davy or William Herschel or even Humboldt, who could be seen as sort of romantic scientists. And what he kind of means by that is they had a broad, holistic vision rather than a sort of a reductionist vision. And I think that more and more people, such as yourselves, are saying that's something we need to recapture.
Well, if I understand, the life of John Stuart Mill was one in which he was just, began with Benthamite utilitarianism, just drilled into him by his father, leading to a nervous breakdown.
Mm,
And then his recovery, largely thanks to his relationship with his wife, was to add the Romanticist vision and to hold those things in some kind of balance, is the way I understand his life. And the way I want to finish up
fascinating.
this wonderful conversation is I just find myself thinking that the intellectual resources for making sense of this and actually having a truly scientific foundation for economics and all other aspects of humanity, the resources for this really are only have become available within the last few decades. And that seems to be almost a shocking thing to say, because it kind of places us as at an important moment of history. I often say that the last 50 years is more than 10% of the scientific revolution. It's only when you combine the study of complexity, which takes beyond the whole apparatus of mathematics, formal mathematics. So the whole complexity revolution plus any kind of sophisticated notion of evolution applied to human affairs. Back then, I've learned, in Veblen's era, evolution meant the evolution of institutions. It was a kind of a holism that,
Mm,
society as an organism was a part of the evolutionary perspective. And so everything we associate with cheating and selfishness and multi-level selection, not even on the radar screen, not even close. And so and that's just like totally foundational for anything that we might do nowadays. So I think it really is the case that we're dealing with the same issues. You hear it again and again back then. How can we reconcile the sanctity of the individual with the welfare of society? That was the great question that everyone was trying to answer. The whole liberal view was somehow respecting the individual and the agency of the individual and their interest in reconciling that with the good of society. That was the question back then, and it's the question now. But our tools for answering it are better. So anyhow, I think that your book provides wonderful, wonderful historical background for that. So I hope it is widely read.
Thank you, David, and yeah, thanks for having me on. And no, I'm really interested in exploring the organic metaphor for society. I think we've been driven by a largely mechanistic metaphor, and the organic metaphor has been associated by people like Karl Popper and others with totalitarianism, and obviously, and you know, that's a whole nother subject. But I think that in our age, when we are realizing more and more the damage that we're doing to the natural world and the way in which society and economics that we've created just doesn't fit in the planet, which is our home. I think we need to look again at those organic ideas and metaphors and work out how we can interpret them better to, as you say, create a better scientific theory going forward.
Yep. All righty. Well, I'm looking forward to more and happy to have captured this conversation for others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Cheers.